Hello, my name is Lynette Pearl, and I am the Senior Associate of Housing with Refugee Housing Solutions. This training is for anyone who wants to learn and understand the basic components of a lease. But before I go into the training, I want to give a brief overview of Refugee Housing Solutions and who we are. So who are we? Refugee Housing Solutions was created to bring housing experts, property owners, key stakeholders, and those working in the refugee resettlement space together in order to discuss best practices and innovative solutions that would increase housing opportunities for newcomers. We are a project of Church World Services funded by the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, PRM. With this funding, we are able to provide resources, trainings, and one-on-one technical support to the 9 resettlement agencies and the 280 affiliates throughout the United States. We also provide services and support to landlords, housing providers, sponsors, and volunteers. Since collaboration and partnerships are vital to addressing this housing crisis, we have initiated a national housing working group and a regional communities of practice. The National Housing Working Group and Regional Housing Communities of Practice provide stakeholders a space to share best practices in order to create innovative housing opportunities for newcomers. So let's get started. In order to be a successful renter, you must understand what a rental lease is, what key things are in a rental lease, and that this is a binding legal contract. So what is a rental lease? A rental lease is a contract between a landlord and a tenant or tenants that allows the tenant to lease or rent the landlord's property for a specified amount of time and under certain conditions. Now you know the basic definition of a rental lease. It's imperative to know the key things to review and understand before signing. Term. Lease terms vary from state to state, but the most common lease term is a year, with short-term leases being 3 to 6 months. Depending on the duration, you can determine if it is a rental lease or rental agreement. A rental agreement term is 30 to 90 days, with 60 to 18 months being a rental lease. Landlord contact information. A point of contact should be listed in the rental lease. Management should outline the criteria of the point of contact for emergencies and maintenance issues. Start date of a lease and end date. The start date of a lease is when it is legally binding, and the end date is when it ends. A lease typically starts on the first of the month. However, it is not uncommon for a lease to start mid-month or on a different day, depending on the time when the lease is signed. Renewals. Many times, a rental lease ends on the date stated, but not always. Some rental leases automatically renew unless written in the lease. So you need to check to see what your lease says about renewals. Most rental leases require the renewal notification 30 to 60 days before the end date of the lease. At that time, during that time period before the lease expires, the landlord should be mailing or hand deliver a letter that states the tenant's renewal status is up. FYI, a landlord is not required to extend or renew a lease and can change any of the terms and conditions, including the rent price during the renewal stage. Even though a landlord does not have to give a reason for a non-renewal, though sometimes those non-renewals must be in writing, there are reasons that a landlord is not allowed to give a non-renewal, and that's based on discrimination and retaliation. So a landlord cannot renew your lease because of these 2 areas. Let's talk about discrimination. A landlord cannot give a non-renewal and cannot choose to not renew a rental lease for reasons that are discriminatory. Discrimination means giving tenants different treatment because they are different from other tenants in a way that is protected by the Fair Housing Act. Retaliation. A landlord cannot give a non-renewal and cannot choose to not renew a rental lease for reasons that are retaliatory. Retaliation is when the landlord opts to not renew a lease because at one point a tenant asserted their tenant rights. It's important to understand that it's perfectly legal for a landlord to choose between people, but that your landlord can make that choice based on, they cannot make that choice based on who asserted their rights as a tenant. So a landlord can have a choice not to renew your lease, but they cannot choose not to renew your lease due to discrimination or to retaliate against you. So let's talk about renewals and the key things you need to look at renewals. And let's look at this example. Miss I Need a Home lease ends on 12/30/22. And the lease requires 30-day renewal notification. Based on her landlord's renewal policy, she would need to give notice on 11/30/22 that she will renew her lease. Notice to vacate policy is very important as well. Knowing a company's notice to vacate and renewal policies are essential because the rental lease end date, we determine when the notice to vacate should be given to the landlord if there would not be a lease renewal. If the rental lease requires a notice to vacate and is not given in a timely manner, a tenant lease could be extended until a proper notification is given. So that's why it's important to know the time period to do your notice to vacate if you're not going to renew your lease. So let's look at our example. Miss I Need a Home wants to move and decide to give her notice to vacate. Her lease requires her to give 60 days notice before the end of the lease date. Her lease ends on 12/30/22. For her to comply with the lease terms, her notice to vacate should be in writing and should be submitted to her landlord by 10/30/22. Late charges. The rent amount and the due date should be reviewed before signing a lease. Especially with market rate properties, rates change. So you want to ensure that's the same rate you saw if you were like looking for your unit before you sign that lease. With income-based properties, 30% of one's income will be the rent amount during the signing. It is also imperative to check the due date because it will determine when late charge will be imposed and the financial penalty. No late fee can be collected unless it is in the lease or addendum. So your lease or addendum has to break down the time period when the late fee will occur. With the Late Fee Fairness Amendment Act, a landlord can only charge up to 5% of the rent as a late fee. If a tenant receives rental subsidy, the late fee must be calculated based on the tenant's portion of the rent. So slightly different when it's was an income-based rent. Your lease should also include your method of payment. The method of payment should be outlined in the lease. I've noticed larger property management companies receive payments on an online portal, and that's the only way they receive payments. So before you lease up, and if you do not have access to the internet or cannot do an online portal payment, see if you can make arrangements with your landlord to have them receive a different other form of payment. But you need to make sure need to know the method of payment. Security deposit. Security deposits have some legal limitations on the amount a landlord can collect. These limitations vary from state to state, but the common practice is 1 month's rent, with some landlords charging an additional amount due to the applicant's credit or rental history. So some landlords require more security deposit if you don't have a rental or credit history, or you have bad credit or lack of rental history. Pet deposits. With the Fair Housing Act, it is unlawful for a landlord to charge additional rent or a pet deposit for service and assistant animals. However, if the animal damages the unit, the landlord may keep some of the security deposit. Now, if you have a regular pet, it's not a service or assistant animal, then some landlords do charge pet deposits and pet rent. So you need to make sure that you look at that in your lease. If you have a pet, your pet gets approved, see what your pet deposit would be and what the pet rent will be as well. One of the biggest things that people want to know is when I'm going to get my deposit, the return of a deposit. Each state has a different time frame when the deposit must be returned after termination of the lease. The rental lease should outline when the landlord should return the deposit. If you're in doubt, again, check with your state because each state is a little bit different requirements. For example, I live in Missouri, and Missouri requires that deposit be returned. If the deposit is going to be returned, it has to be returned within 30 days. Utilities included. Sometimes utilities are covered in the monthly rent, but they are often not. For example, water, trash removal, and sometimes other services. So the rental lease should outline what utilities that you as a tenant are going to be responsible for and what the landlord would be responsible for. So make sure you look at your lease and see what you're going to be responsible. Now, you do have some properties that have utilities included, so that's slightly a little bit different. Occupant, this is part of the lease, will list who will occupy the unit, and that's who signs the lease. And it also has occupancy requirements for the unit. When you're violating this part of the rental lease with unauthorized occupants can jeopardize one's lease. It could be grounds for an eviction. So you need to make sure you read that part of your lease. If the person is not part of the lease, has not signed the lease, you need to see what the requirements are. And that usually goes with the visitor. So we'll talk about that a little bit. The visitor policy. So we'll talk about it a little bit later. Appliances included. The lease will list what appliances are included in the unit. Most rentals come with white good appliances such as a refrigerator, stove, dishwasher, and microwave. But whatever appliances a landlord provides, they are responsible for the repair and the maintenance. Now, if you are the tenant, you provide the appliance, then you are responsible for the repairs and maintenance. But the lease will outline what's going to be included and who's going to be responsible for what repairs. Early termination fees, this is very important. This is one of the key things in your lease. Rental leases include an early termination clause. That's in place to protect the landlord if a tenant decides to break a lease. It often outlines the circumstances for a lease to be broken and includes specific fees that may be required. Early termination fees traditionally are 1 to 2 months of rent. It depends on the landlord and what's in your lease. However, some landlords will allow you to negotiate the early termination fees. Again, that's by case, landlord by landlord. So it's imperative that you look at your early termination fees. There are certain conditions when a lease can be terminated without financial consequences. A lease can be terminated if the tenant is an active member of the military and receives a change of station notice, if they're a victim of domestic violence, or the rental unit is unsafe, uninhabitable, or violates health or safety codes, or the rental itself is illegal. So let's go a little details about if you're a victim of domestic violence. If a tenant or a co-tenant or a household member is a victim of domestic violence, harassment, sexual assault, or stalking, the tenant or co-tenant can terminate their lease by giving written notice of termination to the landlord. Usually landlords request a copy of the police report, or they can see your order of protection. That should be sufficient documentation. So if you're a victim of domestic violence, you have a legal right to break your lease without any financial consequences. The rental unit is unsafe, uninhabitable, or violates health or safety codes. Under code law, every lease comes with an implied warranty of habitability. This means that the unit must meet minimum living standards based on the housing code and local laws. If breaking a lease, if the unit is uninhabitable and you need to break your lease, you should research your health safety codes and the landlord-tenant laws in your state to see how to go about breaking your lease when it comes to the health safety codes issues with a unit. Renter's insurance. Landlords may require a tenant to obtain renter's insurance. If you're required, The lease should outline the minimum coverage you should have in your policy. Notice of entry. Although many states have laws requiring landlords to give prior notice to their tenants before entering a unit, in some states there are no laws. A notice to entry is a formal letter a landlord gives to the tenant of a rental property to inform the tenant of the landlord's intent to enter the residence on a given day at a specific time. In cases of emergency, a landlord does not have to give notification if that's part of your lease. If it's in your lease that they have to give you 24-hour notice. However, if there's emergency, a maintenance issue in your unit, they do not have to follow that in the lease due to it being an emergency. Subletting, this clarifies under what condition the tenant can sublease their unit and how the process. A sublease agreement is a rental contract. Now, this contract is between an original tenant and a subtenant. This document is typically used when the original tenant cannot complete the terms of the lease. Subletting can be an option for when an individual needs to terminate their lease early. However, you cannot go into a sublease because remember, you're still in a contract with your landlord without the approval of the landlord. Unit modifications. Part of this lease explains the process and the parameters of unit modifications. Modifications should not be made to a unit without the written approval of the landlord. You need to read all the addendums. Lease addendums are separate documents that landlords add to an original lease. Landlords use them to provide additional information that the original lease does not cover. A lease addendum is a legally binding document both landlords and tenants sign. A landlord cannot add an addendum to the lease without the tenant's knowledge. So say you sign your lease and 3 months down the line that your landlord wants to add addendum. If they add addendum to the lease, they have to acknowledge, you have to acknowledge it, and they have to have your signature on that addendum. Visitor policy, this is very important because you don't want to have any unauthorized occupants in your unit. It's common for landlords to limit overnight guests, such as allowing a guest for no more than 10 days in any 6-month period. Again, that should be in your lease with written approval. So again, this is important that you know what your visitor policy is. Landlords do this, they do this because they want to keep long-term guests from gaining the status of full-fledged tenants who have not been screened or approved and who have not signed the lease. So that's the reason why they have the visitor policy. Your smoking policy. If the property has a clear no smoking policy in the lease and there is a violation, the landlord has every legal right to start doing lease violations. And if you have so many lease violations, it could lead to a possible eviction. And if the property allows animals, you need to see what the pet policy is. The requirements, like I talked about earlier, some require you to pay a pet fee, a pet deposit, but also pet rent. But also under the pet policy, it tells you what types of pets are allowed, what types of breed, and also there's some weight restrictions. So you need to know what the pet policy is. However, with pet policy, let's talk a little bit more about that. Again, if it's a service or assisted animal and say the property does not allow pets, they would have to give a special accommodation for that, reasonable accommodation if it's a service or assistant animal. Well, this concludes this training. If you need additional support or additional resources, please go to our website at www.refugiehousing.org and just check out our resources and also our upcoming trainings. Thank you.